I read about a man and his wife and his cranky mother-in-law who went on a vacation to the Holy Land. While they were there, the mother-in-law passed away. The undertaker told him, "You can have her shipped home for $5,000, or you can bury her here in the Holy Land for $150." The man thought about it for a while and then told the undertaker, "I'll have her shipped home for $5,000. The undertaker asked, "Why? Why would you spend $5,000 to ship her home when it would be wonderful to be buried here in the Holy Land and spend only $150? The man said, "Well, a man died here 2,000 years ago. He was buried, and 3 days later, he rose again." And then he said, "I can't take that chance." Yes. Let's close in prayer right there. And so we would all agree that family relationships and family responsibilities are tricky and complicated and aren't always easy. Matter of fact, some of the most difficult things we'll ever experience in our life is related around that. And this is true in our day, but it was also true in Paul and Timothy's day, when Paul wrote this letter to Timothy. And remember, we're studying through the book of 1 Timothy, and we're going to answer the question, who should take care of the needy, especially the widows? Is it the family's responsibility, or is it the church's responsibility, or both? And that leads us, I always like to give people a takeaway, something to think about, just to meditate on throughout the week. And our takeaway today is this: the church is not a place, it's a family. The church is not a place, it's a family. This place we meet at, this building, is nothing more than what? A building. It's only the church when we show up. It's not outside of that. Kathy invited a friend to come, and she kind of heard where our church was at and that we were in a strip mall and all this. And she says, "I don't know, it just doesn't look like a church." And there's people who would say, "Hey, it doesn't look like a church." And I would say, it's because it's not. It's a building. How many of you grew up where the church was called the sanctuary? Remember that? And I was a youth pastor I remember playing catch with a football in the sanctuary. The unpardonable sin. I can never be forgiven. And we were throwing this football, and somebody said, "This is the sanctuary." And me being young and foolish said, "No, this is the sanctuary. God lives in me. Doesn't live in this building. I mean, he's everywhere present. He lives in the bar too, I guess." And so I remember that. The church is not a building, the church is us. So in our study, we've called it, our study of 1 Timothy, God's blueprint for a strong church. And remember, Paul left Timothy in Ephesus. He went on to Macedonia, but the church in Ephesus had issues, things that were going on. So he writes them this letter, 1 Timothy, and he writes 2 Timothy, and we're actually going to study that in the fall. Might as well just keep going, right? So anyway, he wrote him 1 Timothy basically to say, here's some things you need to put in order in the church that are out of whack. And so one of those was this whole issue of what to do with the widows. And we're going to talk about that today. But I want you to think about this. We will never change the world by going to church. We will only change the world by being the church. So often we just think going to church is going to save the world. No, it's being the church. It's being in the community. I read a book once called Out of the Salt Shaker into the World. In other words, we're supposed to be the salt of the earth, right? But so often we just hang out in the salt shaker with everybody, all the other Christians. All our friends are Christians. Everything we go to is Christian. And we're not in the world at all. And God says, get out of the shaker and get in the world. Because then you'll have what? Influence. Then you'll be able to make something happen. So I want you to think about this today. So if the church is a family, then we who are blessed with a church home have two families. We have our spiritual family, and we have our biological family. And for some of us, hopefully, they cross over, right? We have a spiritual family and a biological family, and they're all in the same family. But we do have that. So I want you to keep that in mind today as we go through our study. It's an interesting passage. It's not one that most pastors would just get up on a Sunday and say, hey, today I'm going to speak on the widows in the church. But because we're going through the book, we have to address what comes next. And in my study of this, and I've read through it many times, I learned a lot of things. And there's some great principles here on family relationships. And so let's keep that in mind as we study through this today. Don't just say, well, I'm not a widow, it doesn't apply to me. Or don't think, I am a widow, and why is he preaching at me today? Because neither one of those is what we're going to do today. We're going to see what God has for us, see what he says. So notice, first of all, he's going to talk about family relationships there in verses 1 and 2, and in particular, he's speaking to the church family. Look what he says. He says, do not rebuke an older man, but encourage him. I agree with that. I love that verse. As you would a father. Younger men as brothers, older women as mothers, and younger women as sisters in all purity. In the context, remember, Paul's telling Timothy, here's how you correct people in your church. Here's how it says rebuke. It means to correct. Timothy was probably, Matt mentioned it last week, around 40 years old. Late 30s, early 40s. So being that age, he would have had some people in his church that were younger than him, right? And some people in his church that were older than him. He would be kind of in the middle. That's kind of where Matt's at, in the middle. I, on the other hand, seem to be leaning more toward one direction than the other. More younger people in the church than me. But praise God, I'm not the oldest person here. And I was going to say, who is that, but I'm not going to do that. I really don't want to know. It used to be Kathy's dad was the oldest in our church. He was 99, remember? And so he always won that, and I could always use that because I knew who the winner was going to be, but I don't know who that would be today, and I don't want to know. Yeah, exactly. So there's two groups that he mentions here, and I'm going to redefine them. I'm going to say these two groups are the old-timers and the whippersnappers. Okay? Now, what is an old-timer? An old-timer, this is so good, is somebody who's done something for a long time. That's it. That's an old-timer. For me, it's like I've been breathing for a long time. Therefore, I'm what? I'm an old-timer. So look what he says. He says, treat the older men like your father and treat the older women like your mother. I had a good chance to put that into practice. One of the churches I became the pastor of in Everett, Washington, I was in my mid-30s when I was their pastor, and every man on the board was 70 years old. I was half their age. And I was by far the youngest pastor they'd ever had, and that got them all really nervous. And I realized I've got to have these people on my side, these old-timers. So what do I do about that? My father had just passed away at 62. And therefore, some of these guys I got to know, and I basically have read through this text and realized I'm going to treat them like my father. And so I would have a need, and I would say, hey, can you help me with this? I'm building this or trying to do this, and they would come over and help me do it. And pretty soon we built this relationship with these old-timers. And even though they didn't always agree with everything, my philosophy of what I was trying to do because I was half their age, there was a great love that they had and I had for them. And they taught me how to pray, these old-timers. I mean, I'm young, and we had prayer meeting. Remember that in those days? The old, good old prayer meeting. And I'd go to prayer meeting, and the only people that showed up were the people who really loved God. No, not really. But I would go and pray with these old-timers, right, in the room. And we'd go in this room downstairs at our church, and all these guys would get on their knees on a concrete floor before the Lord. And I was just humbled to be in their presence. And to hear them pray was like, I got, Paul and Moses and all of these old saints who had a great relationship with God. And so I treated them like that. And then we had older women in the church that, we were young and we had young kids and they became like parents to us. And so that does work. But I've noticed something about this. I've noticed when a young person comes on too strong with an older person, it doesn't go well. Have you guys noticed that? So I Googled, how do you talk to an older person? Whoa, 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 whoa. The first one, this is so funny, because the first one that they put was this: don't assume every older person can't hear. That was the first one they said. So don't yell. I remember one time a guy told me this guy had I have friends that are this way, I'm not going to mention their names, they have one ear's better than the other. And they said it was the right ear, but I got confused, so I was going to their left side and yelling at them that way, and that was their good ear. So you got to be careful with that. Number 2 is this, and this is so true. Don't talk to them across a room full of distractions. Yeah, you know what that's like. Because you know what we do as old-timers? We've learned how to nod our head like we could hear you. And we have no clue what you said, but we've learned, oh, yeah, for sure. I agree. Who knows what they're talking about. So, yeah. And here's the third one, and this is so true. You young people need to listen to this, especially with your grandparents. And maybe your parents, but especially your grandparents. Don't be condescending, especially when it comes to computers, cell phones, and remote controls. Because, hey, I got a new iPhone 17. I have no idea what I'm doing. And when it's dark, I'm hitting all these buttons. The next thing I know, when the light comes up, I go, oh, crap. Well, I don't know where I'm at. I don't know how to get back there. I give it to my grandson, and he goes, I'll fix it for you. Show me how. They don't have patience with us. They don't show us the steps. They just fix it and give it back to us. And then they make you sound like one time Kathy was working on the phone and something happened, and Adley, one of our grandkids, said, Grandma, let me do it. And she grabbed the phone and just did it and give it back to her. What'd you do? They don't tell you that. Or I go to my son's house and everything is connected to his phone, all of his TV and everything and all this stuff so high tech that I couldn't even figure out how to turn the TV on. And so I just go to Asher. He's like 11. Hey, Asher, can you find us a movie? And so he grabs it, and he's got it all figured out. And I'm going like, man, don't be condescending to us. We didn't grow up with that. We didn't grow up with a computer in our house. We didn't grow up with all this technology. Our first remote, remember when you hit the button? It was like a motor built inside of it. Nothing was electronic. So that's just helping out. Now, a whippersnapper is big talkers with little experience. That's a little brutal, but there's some truth in that. Some goes, there is. Amen, brother. Look what he says. Treat the young men like brothers. In other words, treat them like they were your younger brother. Now, I thought about how my older brother treated me, and for the most part, we had a good relationship. He only did some evil stuff every once in a while. Like one of the worst things he ever did, he booby-trapped my room by opening up all the crossword puzzles in the top of my room, opening up the lids, connecting them onto a string. Oh, yeah, jigsaw. Sorry, yeah. Crossword puzzle wouldn't be a big deal, but jigsaw puzzles are different. And it came down, and when I walked in the door, I knocked all the jigsaw puzzles off into a pile. That's exactly what I did. I was moaning and whining, like, why should I clean this mess up? And then it says there, treat the young women like a sister. I didn't have any sisters, but I understand what he's trying to say there. But then notice what he adds. Paul says, and treat the young women as sisters in all purity. And the idea of that is, Timothy, you need to have some guardrails in place to protect yourself from temptation, from falling into sin. Matt wrote about guardrails in the prayer challenge, day 24, Matt. I want you to know I did read some of them. But, there needs to be guardrails in your life when it comes to counseling other women. Like, don't do it. Needs to be guardrails in your life when it comes to dealing with money within the church, because that's one of the biggest issues people have with churches. You need to have guardrails set up so that when you have a relationship with somebody, it doesn't step over the boundaries that it needs to be. And in your mind, you make up those guardrails before you ever get in that situation. You don't wait and see if something happens, and then you start thinking about guardrails. No, you already make up your mind. These are my guardrails, and I'm going to stick to them. Way easier when you've already made up your mind than it is to try to come up with one at the last minute. It's kind of the Daniel principle. Remember when Daniel got taken off into Babylon? It said Daniel made up his mind before he got there, what? I will not defile myself with the king's food. So when that issue came up, he already made up his mind what he was going to do. So the first thing he talks about here is on family relationships within the church. But then he goes on in verses 3 through 16, and he talks about family responsibilities. And remember here, the context here is widows. And when you study the Bible, you're going to find that God has a special place in his heart for widows. For example, in the Old Testament, Psalm 28 verse 5 said, God is the protector of widows. And if you read through the law, you're going to find that, for example, you couldn't take a widow's coat as a down payment on a loan. It was against the law to do that. In the law, they had gleaning rights, which means that you couldn't harvest everything off of your fields. You had to leave some there. And the reason you left it there is because the widows and the orphans and the people who needed it, like a welfare program, could come and glean what was left over in there. So they had these gleaning rights. They had a tithe every third year. A tithe wasn't 10% in the Old Testament. It was 23 1/3% a year. And so they had a tithe every third year of 10%, and the tithe went to help what? The widows and the orphans. They also had what was called kinsman redeemer, which is where if your husband died, then the brother of your husband was then responsible to marry you. And it was kind of the Ruth idea, if you remember that story in the Bible. So they had that going on. And then in the New Testament, James 1:27 says, religion that is pure and undefiled before God, the Father, is to visit, it says, widows in their affliction. And remember in Acts 6, when the first deacons were started, it was all because of what? The widows were being overlooked in the daily serving of food. And so then, therefore, the deacons were started. So in verses 3 through 16, Paul is telling Timothy who's responsible to take care of the widows in the church. And you have to remember, their day and our day are two different days. In their day, when a woman became a widow, she joined a group of people who were at a very high risk of not making it in the world. There was no government assistance, especially in the Gentile world. Now, when Israel was in the land, then they had all of these things set up to help the widows out. But now we're talking to the church in Ephesus, which was Greek. And even if you were Jewish, you weren't in your own land, so you weren't able to do all these things. So therefore, they were at a very high risk of not being taken care of. And so often they turned to begging, or some even to prostitution, to meet their very basic needs. So he's going to tell us here, the first group that was responsible to take care of the widows was her kids. Look what it says there in verse 3. It says, honor widows who are truly widows. And we're going to see what that means later in our study today. Verse 4. But if a widow has children or grandchildren, let them learn to show godliness to their own household and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. And the point here, it's a very basic Christian principle, is that we are to care for our parents and our grandparents and watch out for them as they grow older. I have experienced that, and so has Kathy, and I just call it role reversal. An example of role reversal is how we use Velcro differently now than we used to. Like you start with Velcro on your diaper, but you end with Velcro on your shoes. Think about that. Now, I lived in a day when there's no Velcro on the diaper, right? Matter of fact, all diapers are cloth in our day. It was a different day. And but we all start with our parents being our caregiver, but we end with being our parents' caregiver. And that's how God designed it to be. And that's relationships within the family. And I know how difficult that can be. My mom and I, when my father passed away, we had an up and down relationship for sure. It wasn't always great. And there were times when I would be upset. And I would say, why do I go down there to visit her if I'm just going to get verbally abused or feel like crap when I'm leaving? And so I would kind of just shut her off. And Kathy would say to me, you need to go see your mom. And I'd want to argue, like I'm great at that, justifying why I shouldn't go. But down in my heart, I knew I needed to, because she was right. Because my brother lives in Florida, and my mom lived in Salem, and I lived here in Bend. And it wasn't that far for me to go. And I needed to go down and see what was going on and help her out and make sure everything was okay. And I'd have to force myself to do it. And when I did it, I knew it was the right thing to do. It was. But it's not always easy, and a lot of you know what I'm talking about. It's not easy at all. But this is what God says here. Hey, it was my responsibility as her son to take care and to see what was going on and make sure she was okay. So the first responsibility went to the kids. The second one went to the relatives. You're going, oh, crap. I don't like that. But look what he says there in verses 5 through 7. First of all, he's going to clarify who the widows indeed were. And this is interesting because these are the widows that the church was going to be responsible for. And look what he says in verse 5. She who is truly a widow, left all alone, and has set her heart on God, and continues in supplications and prayers night and day. So the qualification for the church to support you as a widow was, first of all, you had to be a widow that was left all alone. In other words, there was no one to support her. There was no husband to take care of her, and there was no family to take care of her. She was left alone. The word widow is interesting. It literally means robbed. The word does not describe how the woman was robbed, but that she was robbed. In other words, her husband was robbed from her. But it's a broad word. And this word could include death. It could include desertion. It could include divorce. It could even include like imprisonment. Anytime this woman was left alone for whatever particular reason, then she could be on this list. And then secondly, she was to be a believer. She has set her hope on God and continues in prayers day and night. And I want you to notice in verse 6, he talks about who shouldn't be supported. And he says to this, but she who is self-indulgent is dead even while she lives. In other words, this is a person who is physically alive but spiritually dead, where the number one pursuit of their life was themselves. And what's interesting is that could be anybody, right? Anybody. It doesn't take a rocket science to figure out if a person's passion is God or themselves. You can just tell by how they live their life and what the priorities are in their life. So now in verses 7 and 8, he finally gets to the responsibility of her relatives. And look what he says, verse 7. Command these things as well so that they may be without reproach. But if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. Now that's quite a strong statement. But what he says here is basically this. Non-believing people many times take care of their families better than Christians do. So in other words, a non-believing person could easily take care of their mom and dad and their family way better than somebody who knows as a believer that it's biblical what they should be doing. And he says that shouldn't happen. The great example of this, and think about this, is Jesus. When he hung on the cross, not only did he think about the sins of the world, not only did he think about, hey, Father, forgive them, right, for they don't know what they're doing, but he also thought about what? His mom. He thought about his mom. He said to his disciple John, John, he said what? Behold your mother. And it says there that John immediately took her into his care. Now, I thought it was interesting that Jesus had brothers and sisters, half brothers and sisters. There were other children there, but he didn't talk to them. They weren't there. He talked to John, who was there, his disciple, and said, hey, John, take care of my mom. But this can be so complicated. Family relationships, and who do I take care of, and who don't I take care of, and relatives, and all of that. And I'm not here to tell you you have to just pray and know, what's the right thing to do, because it's not an easy thing sometimes. For example, I have a friend of mine, his name's Archie. And some of you have heard Archie share his story. But Archie said the best thing his family ever did to him was when they let him hit rock bottom. When he'd be behind in his rent and they'd pay his rent, it just gave him more money to use drugs. When they paid his utility bills, gave him more money to use drugs. When they paid like his loans or they paid one of his car payments to help him out, it just gave him more money to use drugs. So one day they just cut him completely off. And he said he knew he hit rock bottom when he was living in a car with a roommate. That's what he said in his story. And at that moment in time was when he decided, I got to turn my life around. And he did. I worked with him at the therapeutic boarding school that I worked at for 9 years. He was one of our drug counselors. The guy who was the best man at his wedding, I did his wedding, was a Bend PD officer who had arrested him 20 times. Almost shot him once. Archie reached in his hand when he was high on drugs, reached in his pocket to pull out a ninja star. And he was going to throw this ninja star at the cop. And if you'd have brought that thing out, the guy would have shot him. This guy was his best man. Radical turnaround. But you know when it started? When his family loved him enough not to help him anymore. So I know how complicated it can be. And that's something you have to just, pray about, think about, get some counseling about. I'm not going to give you some easy pat answer because there are no easy answers to this when it comes to family relationships. But you do have a responsibility, either way, to take care of your family. And then he goes on. It just gets better. Now he talks about the responsibility of the church. Look in verse 9. He says, let a widow be enrolled. And that enrollment means that they had a list. The church had a list of people who would be qualified in order to be supported by the church. Let a widow be enrolled if she is not less than 60 years of age, having been the wife of one husband, have a reputation for good works. She has brought up children, has shown hospitality, has washed the feet of the saints, and has cared for the afflicted, and has devoted herself to every good work. Wow. Okay. I bet the list wasn't that big. I'm just saying. But I made a list of all the qualifications for church support. I'm just going to run through them really quick here. Remember back in in verse 5, first of all, she must be all alone. In other words, there's nobody else to support her. No family, no relatives, no one else. Secondly, she had to be a believer, set her hope in God. Thirdly, she had to be active in the church, man. She was a servant within their fellowship. Fourth, she had to be 60 years old. I'm not sure why he said 60. I could guess, but I'm not going to. Somebody just said this, that was the common age in their day of retirement. Wouldn't that be great? And then it says she was a committed wife. She was the wife of one husband. It's the exact same terminology of the elder that was to be a one-woman man. She's to be a one-man woman. It doesn't mean she couldn't have been married more than once. Some people take that and say, well, that just means she can only have been married once. No, she could have been married many times. Matter of fact, we have a lady friend who'd been married 3 times, and all of her husbands passed away within a year. And she was telling Kathy her story. And Kath, just kind of being funny, half serious, said, "You're the Black Widow." That's a classic line right there. Oh, what did I say, right? And she kind of smiled, and she's okay. She still hangs out with us once every 5 years. No. And then it says she had to have a reputation for good works. She brought up kids. It doesn't mean you have to have kids, but that they're not a requirement. But she had brought up kids. She's shown hospitality. It literally means the lover of strangers. She's washed people's feet. Either could be a reference to serving other people or literally what? Washing people's feet. She cared for the afflicted. She went out of her way to help people. She was devoted to every good work. In other words, these widows that were put on the list were totally involved in the life of the church. They didn't retire from serving God. They were totally involved. So then he goes on and he talks about the responsibility, of the church. But how about the younger women? Look what he says, verses 11 through 14. Why were they left off the list? Well, verse 11 says this, but refuse to enroll younger widows, for when their passion draw them away from Christ, they desire to marry and so incur condemnation for having abandoned their former faith. Now, the problem here was not that they wanted to remarry. Matter of fact, he was going to tell them you should what? Remarry. That wasn't the issue. The issue, I think, is summed up in 1 Corinthians 7:39, where Paul says this, but if her husband dies, she is free to be remarried to whom she wishes, only in the Lord. In other words, as long as they are what? A believer. 2 Corinthians 6:14, he said, don't be unequally yoked. So everybody, single men, single women, young people especially, if you're a believer, one of your guardrails needs to be this. I'm going to marry a believer. And that's a non-negotiable. You might fall in love with somebody who's not, and you might say to yourself, well, I'll hang out with them, I'll bring them to church, and they'll start coming to church to date you. They all do. And you'll say, well, they'll come to faith later in life. Some do. I've seen it. Some don't. I've seen that as well. Doesn't mean they're not good people. Has nothing to do with that. It's just that that's a guardrail clearly taught in Scripture. And I guarantee you, and it doesn't mean that if you marry a believer, you can't have issues. Because that happens as well. But you should put that as one of your guardrails. Lord, lead me to that person you want me to marry. And Lord, I'm going to set the guardrail. It's going to be a believer. And I want you to know something. You can tell if someone's committed as a believer because a committed believer will go to church without you. They're involved. Their spiritual life is a big part of their life. And if God's number one, I believe in the triangle. Tyler's here. And in their wedding, they both were basketball players, remember? Besides messing up your name, and I'm still sorry for that. I only did it 5 times, so hey, it's not a big deal. But I talked about the triangle offense, because I was figuring there were basketball players, right? And the triangle offense was like wife here, husband here, and God's on top. And every time you move closer to God, you move what? Closer to each other. So when both of you are dedicated to Christ, as you move closer to God, you move closer to each other. But if one starts falling away and the other is moving closer, you move farther apart. So the triangle offense is God's on top, husband on one side, wife on the other, and you're moving toward what? Your relationship with Christ being number one. And so he talks about that. He says, man, hey, don't leave your faith in order to marry someone who's not a believer. And then notice what he says in verse 13. And beside that, they learned to be idlers. I love that word. Going about from house to house, not only idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not say. In other words, if you take somebody who's younger and you put them on this list where they don't have to do anything, and now they're being fully supported, they're going to become what? Lazy. They're going to be bored. And when you get bored, you start hanging out. When you start hanging out with other bored people, what do? You start gossiping and becoming busybodies and worrying about everybody else's life instead of your own because you have no responsibility. They had the same problem in the church in Thessalonica where the church took on helping people. And the more the church helped somebody in the church, what? They decided, why should I work? My church is taking care of me. So Paul then came back and he said what? If they're not willing to work, don't let them eat. Don't feed the people that are lazy. That's what he says. And we all can talk about how our welfare system is messed up. But we won't get into that. That's a sermon for Matt. I just passed that buck right there. It goes right in the front row. Clearly can have that. Okay. And then look at the goal, verse 14. So he basically said, I would have younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. For some have already strayed to Satan. In other words, he's saying they need to keep going in life. Need to keep involved in their life. In our culture, we could say, hey, man, if you had a career or a job, you need to keep moving on in that. And we all know what it's like. Like our oldest daughter's a widow. She's been a widow for 20 years, maybe more. Her husband passed away when she was young, and they had been married 5 years. And she was left. And one of the proudest moments in my life was our son moved in with them. The minute she was a widow, our son, who was just graduated from high school, told, hey, Mom and Dad, I got to move in with Kim because she needs me. And she moved in. And then Kim ended up in Phoenix, where our other daughter lives, Katie. And Kim's the second mom to all of her kids. And we're blessed that they're down there because now she has somebody. But Kim's continued to progress. She finished college. She went to grad school and kept going. And it's been really hard on her. And we see it in her. And it breaks our heart because she's not the person today she was, personality-wise. There's a lot of things going on with her and with the Lord, and bitterness and anger and all those things. But she's our daughter, and we love her, and we try to encourage her and help her when we can. And her brother and sister love her and have taken care of her. And that's kind of what he's talking about here. But she didn't just give up. And I give her tons of credit for that. She pursued and kept going, got her degree, got her job, and keeps working, lives on her own by herself. And it's okay. God's blessed her. But that's what he's talking about here. And then to wrap up, look at verse 16. He kind of sums it all up. And he says, if any believing woman has relatives who are widows, let her care for them. Let the church not be burdened, so that it may care for those who are truly widows. And the idea there is, hey, the church shouldn't be burdened because the church in their day is not rich. Like we have churches that are multi-million-dollar budgets and facilities and money everywhere. That was not the early first century church. They were poor. And therefore, money was at a premium, and they took care of it that way. They didn't overspend it, and they couldn't take care of everybody, so the church shouldn't be burdened with this if the family can take care of it. So the first responsibility for the widows goes to the family. And that could be the widower as well. I mean, a lot of you knew Kathy's dad, Hiram, who moved in with us, lived with us for 4 years, almost 5. And he's a very easy person to get along with at his age. And he was great to have in the house. But I saw how much work it took for Kathy to take care of him. Work full-time, do that, be involved in church, all his meds, all his doctor's appointments, working with the VA, trying to get a hold of somebody for hours she spent, trying to keep him off the phone because he would watch Grit TV. And they would say, if you need special benefits, you need to call this number. Well, he thought he needed them. So he's calling this number on his phone, and he's telling people all this information. Kathy caught him one time, giving out his social security. No, Dad, no. He said, I need that coverage. She goes, I need that dental coverage. And Kathy goes, why? You don't have any teeth. He didn't pay for anything with the VA and Social Security, and he had a supplement, but he thought he needed more benefits, right? They were playing on him. Oh, that drives you crazy. But you know what it's like? There's so much work involved in that. So it's not like it's easy, and a lot of you know what that is. You've experienced it or you will experience it. But then just go back to this. Remember the takeaway. The church is not a place, it's a family. So, who in your family, either your family or your church family, needs encouragement? Who do you know that needs encouragement? Maybe it's somebody in your family, a cousin, a relative. Maybe it's your mom and dad. Maybe it's your brother or sister who just needs some encouragement. Things haven't gone well for them lately, and they need a word of encouragement. then do something this week to encourage them. Maybe somebody in the church that you know that just needs maybe it's a word of encouragement, maybe it's lunch, maybe it's coffee, whatever it might be. Think of that one person, and then this week do something about it. Let's pray.